All right, good morning. The MSU Science Festival Saturday Morning Science is now going live this morning, and we're so happy that you can join us on this beautiful Saturday morning. We are joined today by Angela Holohan, who is a medical laboratory scientist. She teaches for MSU in the biomedical laboratory diagnostics program. She's a certified medical laboratory scientist and a specialist in blood bank. And she is going to be talking to us all about the different types of blood types and what that means. And before we get started, Angela, can you tell us what a medical laboratory scientist is and what they do?
Yeah, so a medical laboratory scientist, again, just like me, we graduate with a bachelor's in science, plus a pretty intense 6 month to 1 year internship. From there, a lot of medical laboratory scientists do work in hospital or clinical laboratories, and there's many different departments that they can choose to work in. There's microbiology, where people work with germs. There's hematology, clinical chemistry, molecular biology, where you're working with DNA. And my favorite, of course, is the blood bank, where we deal with getting safe blood products to people. There are other career options, though, for medical laboratory science. We're not just limited to these clinical labs. We also are in public health laboratories. My husband is a medical laboratory scientist, where he is a microbiologist there. They also do testing on water at the public health lab, or different to make sure the environment is safe. And also there's like newborn screening there. And then a lot of medical laboratory scientists actually work in industry as well. So there's all kinds of career options available for medical laboratory science.
Awesome. Great. So if you're interested in anything laboratory science related, check out MSU's biomedical laboratory diagnostic program. And so with that, Angela, we'll let you start your presentation and tell us all about blood banking.
Okay. So before we can really get into our activity and talk about blood types, I just want to get a foundation laid for everybody, because I know we have all different levels watching today. So if we zoom in really close on our bodies, we would see that all of us is basically made of something called a cell. So this is just a very basic human cell. It might be coming up backwards, but and they have little different parts to them, but we're not going to go into that today. But basically, things like our skin is made up of cells, our muscles, our heart, our lungs, just about everything is made up of the cell. And cells, obviously, our skin and our muscles, they look different, and they also have different jobs. So of course, they also look different. Our cells also look different. This is just a printout I did of some different types of cells. We have here the cells that line our intestines that help us digest food. There's liver cells here that help us break down certain products. This here is called a neuron. Neuron is a nerve cell. They're in our brain, and they travel throughout our body to allow us to move. These are called osteoclasts. They are bone cells. So you can see that even though we have everything is a cell, they all have different jobs, so they all look a little bit different. What we're going to focus on, now that we understand what a cell is blood. So about half of our blood is made up of something called plasma, and that's not cells. It's a yellow liquid, and it carries things like nutrients or food to all of the different cells in our body. It carries important messages to our cells that tell them what to do. And it also takes waste products away. But the other half of our blood is made up of cells. So you might have noticed if you cut yourself, you start bleeding. So that's your blood. Just wanted to clarify that. And blood travels all over our body in something called the blood vessel, which are little tubes. If I look at my wrist, I can actually see some of my blood vessels. So blood is traveling there, and it's our heart that is pumping that blood all over our body. So if we look inside a blood vessel here, this is a little coloring I did. There's 3 different types of cells in our blood. The very smallest are called platelets. So platelets, like I said, sometimes we cut ourselves and we start to bleed. When we stop bleeding, it's because of platelets and a lot of other things as well. But platelets are what help us make a clot. They help us stop bleeding. Now, the largest type of cell in our body is called a white blood cell. So white blood cells are part of our immune system. And there's lots of different types of white blood cells, and they have different jobs within the immune system. But basically what they do is they recognize things that are foreign to our body, things like germs, and they will destroy them or get rid of them. So they help keep us healthy and not get sick. But I just want to point out that they also will destroy things that aren't germs. And that's going to be important in our talk later, that it's not just germs that they fight. So anything that they see that's foreign to our bodies, they will destroy. So that's going to be important, as I said, and they're the largest cell. Now, the most numerous cell in our bodies are called red blood cells. So they kind of look like donuts with the hole not punched out. And red blood cells have a very important job. Red blood cells carry oxygen. So oxygen is a gas in the air that we breathe into our lungs. The red blood cells travel to our lungs, they pick up that oxygen, and then they travel to all over our body, and they deliver that oxygen to all of the cells in our body. And our cells need oxygen to stay alive. It's a very complicated process, a lot of biochemistry. I'm not going to go into that, but just know in order for our cells to be alive and healthy, they need oxygen. So, Jack, can you stop jumping around? Sorry, my son Jack is going to help me here, but he's kind of waiting till we get to the cookies. So as I was saying, they carry oxygen and they release it to our cells. And if our cells don't get enough oxygen, they start to get very sick and they can actually start to die without oxygen. So red cells are really important in keeping us healthy and alive, really. Now, a lot of people wonder why red blood cells are red in color. So we have to look even closer. We have to zoom in even closer. So I have a picture here. So this is a red blood cell. I think the writing is backwards, but it has the fancy scientific name for it, which is erythrocyte. If we looked inside a red blood cell, it's full of all these tiny little molecules called hemoglobin. And hemoglobin is what carries those oxygen molecules. Each hemoglobin can carry 4. And if we looked even closer, we would see a molecule called heme that's part of hemoglobin. And right in the center is a little molecule, and that is iron. So every hemoglobin has 4 irons in it, and iron is red in color. So because our red cells are full of hemoglobin, they're also full of iron, and that's what gives the red cells the red color. So the first thing we're going to do with our activity is we're going to give our red blood cells, which are cookies, we're going to give them hemoglobin. So I have 8 cookies here, so you're going to need at least 8. I made them round because I want them to look like red blood cells. And then Jack is going to be my helper here, and we have red icing. So this is going to be my hemoglobin. So we're going to, if you're working along, you can also, this one's yours, fill up your cookies with hemoglobin.
And while you're filling your cells with hemoglobin, I have Catherine on the line too. She works with the Science Festival. She's one of the coordinators of the festival. So she's monitoring our Facebook page. And if you have questions, she'll ask them to Angela. So keep your questions coming in. Catherine, do we have any questions coming in?
We do. We have a couple questions. Earlier, Erica asked the difference between a white blood cell and a red blood cell, which you covered a little bit. So Erica, if you have any other questions along that line, feel free to type those out in the question. Let's see. Roxanne is wondering, is there anything in the body that is not made of cells?
So like I was talking about in our blood, for example, there's plasma. So that's just like a liquid that carries different tiny little molecules. We have tissues that are not made of cells. They're made of like proteins. So there are parts of our body that are not made of cells, but most of the things that are really like working or really doing a very important job are actually made of cells. But yes, there's kind of filler material that's also very important that is not cells. But I will say all of that material is usually made by cells. Not necessarily everything in the plasma, but some of it for sure. So cells are really fundamental to our bodies.
Let's see. Claude has a question about iron. They're wondering, why is iron red inside the body but becomes silver outside of the body?
That's more of a chemistry question. I am not the best chemist in the world. So I will leave that to the chemist. I'm sorry, I can't answer that.
That's all right. Great question, Claude.
Yeah, and with iron, iron turns red outside of the body when it's oxidized. So when oxygen attaches to iron, it's what causes rust, which is red. So iron outside the body will be red if it's oxidized with oxygen. So that's why in the body, it's hooked to oxygen. So maybe that's why it looks red in the body. I'm just guessing there. That would be my guess.
You're a better chemist than me.
All right. Any other questions out there? If you have a question for Angela, feel free to enter that into the comments section and we will read them out loud.
Let's finish this one up. All right, we are about done giving our red cells oxygen. So they are ready to go. Okay. So before we move on to blood types, I just have to give another quick little lesson. So if you ever look around at other people, and I'm sure you've seen lots of other people, you notice that everybody looks a little bit different. So we have different color eyes, like I have brown hair and Jack has blonde hair. We have different shapes of our faces, we're different heights. And all these kinds of things are called traits. And how we get these traits is through something called our DNA. So I have another picture here and we're going to really zoom in on our DNA. So we have a cell here and most cells, although red cells are actually an exception, most cells have a nucleus. And when we look inside the nucleus, we really zoom in, we see these structures called chromosomes. And if we zoom in even further on that, we see this double helix, and that's called DNA. And DNA basically provides our bodies with the recipe for different traits and also for the recipes just to do normal functions. But so like I said, Jack has blue eyes. So that means that his DNA has a recipe that gives him blue eyes, where his brother has brown eyes. So he has a different recipe on that same spot on his DNA that gives him brown eyes. And the way that we get these traits is from our parents. So you'll have to forgive me. I am a much better scientist than I am an artist, but I drew Jack a family tree. So of course this is Jack. And you'll see he gets half of his DNA from me. So I'm his mom, but half of his DNA came from his dad. So everybody gets half their DNA from each of their parents. So Jack's dad got half of his DNA from his mom and half of his DNA from his dad. And I got half of my DNA each from my parents. So we inherit our DNA from our parents. That's why a lot of times you hear people say, oh, you have your father's eyes, or you look just like your mom. And some of that is because of the recipes, the DNA recipes that you inherited from your parents. And one of the things that we inherit from our parents are blood types. So just like we look different, we have different eye color, we have different hair, we also have different blood types. So even though we can't see these things with our eyes, they are inside of us and they're a little bit different for different people. So what we're going to do is we're going to work through the different blood types so that you can understand what that means. So the first thing we're going to talk about really is the ABO blood type. And this is kind of they call it the granddaddy of them all. It is the primary blood type that we care about. So there's 4 ABO blood types that we see in the population with some extremely, extremely rare exceptions. There's A, B, AB, and O. So no matter what your blood type is, your cells, your red cells, they work just fine at doing their job of carrying oxygen around the body, but they just have a little bit of differences. If we go back and we look at our red blood cell, of course, they carry hemoglobin inside of them, but they have to have something to hold the hemoglobin in, right? And that's called the cell membrane. And the cell membrane, you can kind of think of it as the red blood cell's skin. It holds it inside. And even though we all have some common features of our red cell membrane, we also have little differences. And they really don't affect the function for the most part of our red cells, but different people have just a little bit different red cell membranes. And our ABO blood type is what is one of those differences. So we're going to make our different blood types with our cookies here. And the first type we're going to make is type A. So I'm going to take 2 of our cookies. So, and I have 3 different types of sprinkles. So this is important. They have to be, you have to be able to distinguish them. So I'm going to use, I have some stars here. And basically, people who are type A, their DNA has a recipe to put A sprinkles on their red cell membrane. We call it the A antigen. It's kind of like a little bump on their membrane that you can't even see with your eye. It's just kind of sticking out a little bit. So we're going to sprinkle type A onto our cookies that are going to be A. And type A people, they make lots of A sprinkles. So we can be pretty generous with our sprinkles. If you're, here, you want to put A on yours? Can you sprinkle? I guess I'm going to do it. Okay. Okay, so my cookies are now full of A sprinkles, and I will bring the camera over in a little bit so we can see all of the blood types once we're done. Now, just so that we can remember that this means type A, I have some writing icing, and if you're going along with me, you're just going to want to write an A on these A cookies, and write it not exactly in the center, write it slightly to the left, because we're actually going to end up adding something later, so we need a little bit of room. So I'm writing an A. Okay, so just bring this over. So you can see I have my type A cookie and it has type A sprinkles on it. So these are my type A blood cells. And type A is actually a pretty common blood type in the United States. About 40% of the population is type A. So we're going to grab 2 more cookies now, and we're going to make type B red cells. So at the very same spot on type B people's DNA as the type A, they have a different recipe. So they make a different type of bump or sprinkle on their red cells, and we call it the B antigen. So I have some circular sprinkles here, and those are going to be my type B antigen. And they have lots of B sprinkles on their red cells. So go ahead and sprinkle your type B sprinkles on your B cells. And like I said, you can be pretty generous. They make lots and lots of B. Okay. So now, just so we remember that this means B, we're going to write a B on our cookie. But again, leave yourself a little bit of room to the right of the B. So write it a little bit on the left. Okay, so now you can see I have my type B cookie or red cell, and it's different from my A. It has different sprinkles on the surface of it. So the next one we're going to do is type AB. And this one's kind of interesting. Oh, I guess I forgot to mention. So type B is not as common as type A. Type B is about 11% of the population. So if we look again at that family tree, type AB is kind of fun. Remember, we inherit half of our information from our mom and half from our dad. What happens with this person who's type AB is that they inherit the recipe for A from one parent, but their other parent gave them the recipe for B. So type AB people have both the A sprinkles and the B sprinkles on their red cells. So to make an AB, we have to put both sprinkles on. So I'll give Jack the A. I'm going to start with the B. And again, they make, oops, that is a lot of sprinkles. Here, we'll use these. So we want to make sure we see both the A and the B sprinkles. Now this is where it's going to get a little tricky for me. I made my cookies a little small, and I got to fit an AB on here with a little bit of room to spare. Okay. So I'm just writing an A and a B next to each other here. Not my best work, but it's legible enough. Okay. So I now have, whoops, an AB red cell. So it has both the A and the B sprinkles on it. So AB people make both A and B. Now the last blood type we're going to talk about is type O. Oh, I keep forgetting to mention my percentages. So type AB is pretty special. It's the least common red blood type in the population. Only about 4% of people are type AB. So finally, we're going to talk about type O. And whenever I teach blood types, after we've talked about A and B and AB, and I ask, well, what do you think is on type O? A lot of people say, well, they must make the O sprinkle or the O antigen. And that's not true. So what an O means, you can think of an O almost like a 0. What an O means is that there's not A and there's not B. They just don't make those sprinkles. So we're not actually going to put any sprinkles on our type O red cells. All we're going to do is we're going to write an O. So it's not the most beautiful O, but we have our type O red cell. So they just don't have A and they don't have B sprinkles. So those are our 4 main blood types for the ABO system. And you might be wondering now why it matters, because like I said, it doesn't really affect how our red cells work. And the reason why it matters is sometimes some people get very, very sick with a certain condition called anemia. And it has many, many different causes. But basically what that means is that they don't have enough red blood cells, or their red blood cells are not working correctly. And so they're unable to deliver enough oxygen to the cells in their body, and they start to get very sick. Another time something like this can happen is if there's a very bad accident and somebody suffers a pretty severe injury and they lose a lot of blood. Their body can't replenish that blood quickly enough to keep that oxygen delivery where it should be. So anytime that this happens, the people usually need to go to the hospital, and they need something called a blood transfusion. And what a blood transfusion is normal, I should say healthy people can go to a blood donation center and they can donate their blood. Not all of it, obviously. They just take enough that's safe, but it's still a pretty good amount. And they collect it in a bag. And then these bags of blood get sent to different hospitals where they are stored in the blood bank. And when somebody needs a blood transfusion, we can give them one of these bags of blood. Now, this is kind of what a normal bag of blood looks like, but you'll notice that the blood type is listed. This one is type B. And blood type really, really matters when it comes to blood transfusions. And the reason why, if we go back to our blood cells, remember our white blood cells. I said that they are really good at fighting things that are not us. They recognize things that are foreign to our bodies and they say, this does not belong here. And they kill it or they destroy it. And a lot of people think of that in terms of germs, but it actually does it to other things too. And one of the things that it can do that with is those sprinkles, those blood types. So even though the sprinkles are really small for us to see, for our immune system to see, they're actually pretty big. And so our immune system is really, really good at seeing sprinkles that don't belong or that don't match us. So what will happen is if let's say we have a type A person and we gave them B blood, their immune system would notice that B sprinkle and it would start to destroy those red cells. And unfortunately, sometimes our immune system works a little bit too hard. It's a little bit too good at its job. And what happens is the reaction that you have when you're destroying these red cells can make you very, very sick. It can actually be life-threatening. If you give enough of the wrong blood type to somebody, it can actually end their life, which is obviously nothing that we would ever want to happen. But honestly, even if you survive, it's very hard on your body. So what happens if somebody needs blood is a phlebotomist will go and draw their blood and bring it down to the blood bank. And then a medical laboratory scientist working there will test that person's blood to determine their blood type. And then they will select the correct product for them, the right type of blood. So we're going to do a little activity to kind of show how this works. I'm going to bring the camera over. So hopefully you can see my cookies. And there's a printout that's going to be on the website so that you'll be able to do this as well. But you can kind of, even if you're going along right now, you can kind of work through. And what we're going to do is show how we match different blood types. So I have a chart here that it might be a little difficult to see, but basically we're going to start, let's say our patient is type A. So they have the A sprinkle. And what we need to find is blood that would be safe for them to get. And any blood that, as long as it either matches their sprinkle, basically it has to just not have a sprinkle they don't have. So obviously type A people can get type A blood. They have the same sprinkle. But type A people can also get type O blood because there's no sprinkles there for it to attack. for people who are type A. They're not going to recognize anything bad on there. So type A people can receive A and O blood. Now for type B people, obviously they can't get A blood. That has the wrong sprinkle. They can't have AB blood either because that has A sprinkle on it. But they can of course get B blood. They have the same sprinkle. And they can get O because again, there's no sprinkles on there that they're going to attack. Now AB people, these people are pretty lucky. They have both sprinkles, right? So of course they can get AB blood, but they can also get A blood. There's no sprinkles on there that don't match them. They can get B blood because again, they have the B sprinkle too, and they can get O blood because again, there's no sprinkles there that they would attack. So type AB people are called the universal recipient. That means they can get any of the 4 blood types. So they're pretty lucky. Now, on the other hand, our type O people, they don't have any sprinkles, right? So they can't get any of the blood types that have sprinkles. They can only receive type O. So very important there. But one thing you might have noticed is that every single blood type can get type O because that O's don't have any sprinkles. So what we call type O people is the universal donor. So they can have go to any blood type. Now, why this becomes important even more is, like I said, sometimes when people have an accident and they lose a lot of blood because of an injury, or they're very, very sick and something happens where they've just lost a lot of blood and they need a blood transfusion right away. And the time that it takes for somebody to draw their blood, for the medical laboratory scientists to do the testing is too long. They need blood now. So what we can do if we work in the blood bank is that we can give them type O blood because we know that for almost everybody, type O blood is going to be safe. It can go to every blood type. So that's why we really like our type O donors. If you've ever donated blood before and you're a type O, you might have noticed you get a lot of phone calls from the donor center asking you to please come back. And that's one of the reasons why, because we can give type O to anybody. So now we're going to move to the next part. If we look at my bag of blood again, if I can find it. Like I said, I pointed out that there is a type B there, but you can see under it, there's also the word positive. And so a lot of times when people hear about blood types, they don't just hear A or B or AB. They hear things like A positive or AB negative. There's always that positive or negative that comes after. And the reason why, so the ABO system, that's one of our blood types. We actually have, in addition to that, all kinds of other blood types. There's lots of different sprinkles out there that go on our red cells. And for the most part, we don't really pay attention to them because they're really small and most everybody, their immune system doesn't see them. There are exceptions to that, and that's part of big thing of being in the blood bank is finding those exceptions. But for the most part, for routine transfusions, we don't worry about those other blood types with one exception. So, and that has to do with the D antigen. So D is another type of sprinkle. I'm going to use my chocolate sprinkles. And it's part of a family called the RH family. There's lots of types of sprinkles in the RH family, not just D, but D is the main one. It's the one that's most likely after ABO to cause problems. So basically, people are either positive for D or they're negative for D. They either have it or they don't. So I'm going to take 4 cookies, one of each of my ABO blood types, so AB, AB, and O, and I'm going to make them my positive blood type. So all we have to do is just sprinkle some of our D onto the cookie. And D is it's very common to be positive for D. About 85% of the population is positive for D, whereas only about 15% are negative. So I added my D sprinkles, and I'm just going to add a plus sign next to the letter on here. Stick.
Angela, just really quickly, we have a question. Could you explain what the D stands for again?
So D is just the name of that sprinkle. So it doesn't actually stand for anything. It's its own name. It's the D antigen. So it's another sprinkle. It's not related to ABO. Its recipe is located on a different piece of DNA. So people either have the recipe for D or they don't. So now I have my 4 positive, so my positive for D cookies. So now I can grab my other 4. These are going to represent my negative, and they just don't have any extra sprinkle for D, no sprinkle. So all I have to do is write a negative sign next to my letter. Not the prettiest, but okay. So now you have in front of you, if you're doing this along with me, the 8 main blood types that we really work with in the blood bank. Like I said, we do work with those other blood types for certain patients, but for the most part, these are the main ones we care about. So there's A positive, B positive, AB positive, and O positive. And then there's A negative, B negative, AB negative, and O negative. So where this matters, we always try, if we can, to match not only somebody's ABO type, but also their D type, if they're positive or negative. It's not quite as important, but if we possibly can, we will match it, because a lot of times it might not cause a problem the first time you get it, but it might cause problems later for certain people. It's beyond the scope of my talk today, but if this really interests you, you can look up something called hemolytic disease of the newborn. The D antigen is what was the main cause of that for many, many years. And it used to basically make it so that certain women could no longer have children. So it does play a very important role, and we always try to match with D. Now, so if you look at this, and if you were to try and match all the different blood types, you would notice that our absolute favorite blood type, of course, is O negative. So O negative, because they don't have any sprinkles at all, right? They don't have A, they don't have B, and they don't have D. So that means they can go to just about everybody all the time. So they're very, very precious blood to us. If we have those emergency transfusions, if we can possibly give people O negative, we will do our very best to do that. But it's not always possible. Sometimes we do have to give O positive. And the reason why is only about 15% of people are Rh negative or D negative. And so if you think about it, 45% of people are O. 15% of those people would be O negative. So that's a very small number to be already. According to the American Association of Blood Banks, only about 38% of our population is eligible to donate blood. So there are some strict rules for donating blood. And that's not only to protect our patients who are receiving blood, it's also to protect our donors. You really shouldn't give blood if it would not be safe for you. So 38% of those O negative donors would be eligible. And then the AABB estimates of those 38%, only about 10% of people who are eligible will actually donate blood. So we are always short on O negatives. We never have enough, because not enough people are able to donate or willing to donate. So that is like I'm blanking out on the word, but basically that's my spiel. Like, please donate blood if you can. It's so important. In the coronavirus pandemic, we're not having blood drives going on right now. And so as a result, there's been a pretty severe shortage of blood of all types. So no matter what your blood type is, if you are eligible, I do strongly encourage you to contact your local blood center and try and donate blood if you can, because even though a lot of people are home, there's always people that need a blood transfusion. There's people with cancer who are on chemotherapy who are supported by blood transfusions. There's people with chronic anemias that they inherited in their DNA, things like sickle cell anemia. A lot of them are transfusion dependent. And of course, there's always people that sometimes have an accident and will need blood. So please do contact your local blood center if you possibly can. Arrange to donate blood. You can truly save somebody's life. So that's kind of the end of what I have in terms of our activity today. As I said, there is going to be a handout posted on the Science Festival website. And the handout that I made, I did have an additional activity for any of you who found this really interesting. And particularly if you're really interested in genetics, ABO blood types are really good for introducing concepts of basic genetics. So I did create a bonus activity that you can do either with your cookies, or I created some cutouts that you can use where you can learn how to do something called a Punnett square. And what you do is you basically end up determining, if you know the parent's blood type, you can figure out the potential blood types of their children. And that's a lot of fun. And you can learn a lot of different terminologies that we use in genetics, like genes, alleles, homozygous, heterozygous. You can be an aficionado on genetics. And then finally, on the very last page, I did create a recommended resources. And these are kind of vary in the age appropriateness of like what level they are, but there's some YouTube videos, and then there's also some books that I've checked out that I would really recommend if you found any of these topics interesting. I really enjoyed, I have a few here. Have a Nice DNA if you want to learn more about DNA. There's also a really nice story about Gregor Mendel that I would recommend. He's kind of the father of American genetics, and he had some really life-changing, or I'd say humanity-changing experiments with pea plants, where he really figured out or paved the way for modern scientists to understand how different traits are inherited. If you want to know more about cells, this is a really fun book, Know Your Cells by Fran Brickwell. And if you really liked blood, I really liked this book. My kids like this one too. It's called A Drop of Blood, and you follow a vampire and his monster assistant as you look through blood. So I do recommend those as well. But anyway, that's what I have for my presentation today, and I'm happy to take any questions.
We did have a couple of questions come in. We had one from, I'm trying to think of their name. Anyway, they wanted to know what DNA stands for, if you know what the word is for DNA.
Yes, it's a deoxyribose nucleic acid. That's a long, long word. And it has to do with the biochemistry of how it's put together.
Awesome. And then they want to know, can kids donate blood?
I believe in Michigan, the minimum age is 16. And really, there has been some recent studies, so that it might not be the best idea until you're more into your 20s, because it is a little bit hard on your body. And unfortunately, teenagers tend to not have the best diets, and they're also growing. Your brain is developing, and you need a lot of iron for a good developing healthy brain. So make sure that you are in very good health if you're going to donate as a teen. Just make sure we don't want to harm you in the process. So, but yeah, for kids, you guys still need all your blood. You can't really have any to spare.
Okay. Great. I think there are like even weight guidelines and they do all kinds of testing too. Am I correct on that?
Yep, there's a minimum weight. I think you have to be at least 110 pounds. And then they'll do some quick blood tests to check your hemoglobin level and how many kind of percentage-wise red blood cells you have, just to make sure that it's healthy for you or safe for you to donate blood.
Great. And then Erica wanted to know, how do you know what your blood type is?
So you have to basically have a physician's order to do that. A lot of women find out their blood type when they get pregnant because of that whole hemolytic disease of the newborn thing. People that have had surgeries or are going in for surgery will often get their blood type, but it's not really something that we just kind of order for fun, I guess.
You might do it in your high school biology class. I seem to remember doing that in high school.
Yeah.
Erickson wants to know, I guess it's his kid who's 10 wants to know, is there DNA in blood cells since there's no nucleus?
In red blood cells, no, there's not. So red blood cells actually do start with a nucleus when they're still in your bone marrow. But before they exit your bone marrow, they will and go into your blood.